What we decided to do, this is going to be a little different than a normal presentation. Darren and I would say, get asked a lot of questions about lighting. Some of them we pass on to our lovely lighting colleagues who are here in the room. Other ones we pass on to the scientists. Others we try to figure out from a practical point of view ourselves. So we're going to go through some of our greatest hits of lighting questions that we've received. This is theoretically supposed to be an addendum after the other lighting presentation I'm giving. So I'll try to keep them completely separate and minimize this one so you guys don't have to listen to me too much this afternoon. Okay, let's get this one started. Before we get into the questions you asked me, I'm going to ask you a few questions as well. So first of all, who here has lights inside their chicken houses? Don't be shy. Raise your hands. Everyone, okay. Who here uses light in any way in their chicken houses, whether it's sunlight or, I better see every hand up here. Chickens don't lay without light, people. It's okay. Okay. The other one, who here can identify how many foot candles of light are at your table? Anyone? Be thinking about that because I'm going to circle back and ask you that question a little later in this presentation. Why do we care about lighting? Most importantly, we care because it makes our chickens go. We care about them for waking the chickens up, for having them eat. Most importantly, for having them lay. We're in the layers section, so we can just talk about eggs here. We don't have to be generalistic. We want eggs. Most of us care about more eggs as much as possible. And we also want them to go to bed. Again, now that we're in cage-free, getting chickens to wake up, get out of the system, go back into the system, go to the right nest, all of this is way more important than it used to be. And lights, although they're not the only thing that help them do this, also are very important in managing these behaviors. Again, stimulating production, chickens are really cool in that once we give them about 13 hours of light, we will actually get them to come into lay. Birds will come into lay with less than 13, but you're not going to get the peaks that you want. We typically go to 15 or 16 hours here in the layer industry, but there's a lot of places around the world that don't have any additional light, and they're laying them on between 11 and a half and 12 and a half hours, and there's absolutely no issue. So it's pretty unique. And then, most importantly and most challengingly, we use them to try to manage behavior. That's probably the bulk of the questions that Darren and I receive is how do we get the birds to stop doing what they're doing, or how do we get birds to start doing what we want them to do? We're going to start with pullets. Two of the most common questions we get are about light intensity. So how does early light intensity affect light life behavior? And how much do I turn up the intensity when I try to start to stimulate our birds? These are really good questions. And we'll get into the what is light intensity a little bit later. But these ones I think are pretty important. The first question is, well, do we really know? After hearing Darren's presentation, it made me question everything I know about lighting. So there's a lot more unanswered questions than we have answered questions. So the answers we're going to give here for this are in our practical experience. And our practical experience says we want them bright for the first 2 weeks at least, and then we want them not bright for the next 16 weeks, 15, 16 weeks, until you move them. And then we want them a little brighter until we get them to the lay house. And then we want that a little less light than the layer house, so that way when they go to the layer house, they're more likely to come into production. Is that clear to everyone? I'm sure you can all take that program back and say, yeah, they want it light, then less light, and then a little brighter. Simple. So realistically, we want about 5-foot candles when we start the chicks at the level of the water line. This really helps birds go to the nipples. Almost every bird you're getting in cage-free now is going to have some type of infrared beak treatment. And if they can't see the water line, if they can't see the water droplet, it's going to be really challenging them to go there. Especially as we learn now that if their vision, if they can't see much more than about here, if it's not really shining off, if there's not that contrast, and that's what we're aiming for that contrast, the water drop that's reflecting the light. and try to get the chicks to go there, because what happens if you don't drink water at the beginning? Dr. Gingrich? They die, yeah. So we want the birds to go to water, and then we want to dim it down, especially for free-range birds. In the aisle, we don't want it more than between a half and 1 foot candle. It's going to be brighter inside the system so the birds can see and eat, but we don't want it too bright on the floor. We want them to be able to see enough to get down there and then see enough to go back up, but we really do want it dark. Darren, how many pullet houses do you go into after 6-7 weeks where it's brighter than a half a foot candle on the floor? A lot of them, and that's, I mean, we say that almost every time we go into that. We probably need to turn the lights down. How much? Well, darker than this. I'm going to jump over this. Again, everyone should have their proceedings. This is in our online management guide. This is just a generic, what do you need to do? When do you want to stimulate it? And ideally, again, after the 2 weeks, you've stepped down the intensity, and then the step down is just for the hours. So we can chat more about this if you have questions about your actual programs later. Now for laying hens. This is one of my favorite questions. We started a conversation about lighting and we started talking about ventilation. I call this the Darren special. We get a lot of questions, especially in lay, is our birds are piling or our birds are going a little bit crazy or they're all going to one side of the house or the other. What's wrong with the lighting? It must be flicker. And so I've dealt with a lot of potential flicker cases, and I would say 90+% of them have all turned out to be ventilation challenges. In cage-free, if our ventilation isn't set up correctly, then the birds are going to migrate either to the preferred condition or away from the bad condition, and it depends which situation it is. And so not only having a light meter, but having some type of, at the baseline, a infrared point-and-shoot temperature gun that you can go in and test. Ideally, you can have one of those infrared thermal cameras. Those are pretty useful for looking at aviaries and seeing if there are hot and cold spots and if your ventilation is set up. There's a number of construction and ventilation companies also in the room who I'm sure can help us with their opinions because they know way more about that than I do. Using lights can help us move the birds around if there's a ventilation challenge, but ultimately we need to fix the root cause instead of just going on and try to manage it just solely with the lights. Another question we get, and this one, and Darren, I don't know about you, but I've been getting this one a lot less now, as I think everyone is starting to get used to the program, get used to doing this. The big one, though, that we've been going around talking with people a lot this week, and the big one that we've had that some people are doing, and it really is six of one, half dozen of another, but it's, do you turn the lights off top down or do you turn them off bottom up? And our baseline recommendation is we like to, in the system, turn the lights off from the top system and have the last light that goes off the lower system, and that's what we have on here. That helps the last little stragglers of birds on the floor to have some place to go to jump up. It also helps if you have brown feather birds in there because they soak up a lot more light. There's only a few situations we've found where you want to go the reverse and have that top level the last one. And so I would say this has been a pretty standard recommendation for us for several years, but we're still finding a little bit of the opposite. It's not to say that's wrong, but if you're having challenges getting birds to go up into the system right at the end, something worth looking into. Anything to add, Darren? Matching pullets and layers. Applicable for multiple situations here. The next question, and this is jumping around a little bit that we get, but we get a lot of, what is a brown bird pre-stimulation program? This is one of those, because I know there's a few brown birds in here. We really like to pre-light the birds at about 3 pounds. So sometimes everyone waits until 3.1, 3.2 pounds. Giving a boost of an hour at 3 pounds helps kind of prime the brown birds. We found this for pretty much all varieties of birds, both brown and white, is that since 20 years ago, birds aren't quite as responsive to light stimulation like they used to be. It used to be you could give them an hour and boom, everyone would come into production. Now things are a little bit more delayed and we have to be a little bit more aggressive in some areas. Also with cage-free and birds are moving around and choosing their own lighting environments, it does help. So any questions about this, let us know. but this is a pretty good recommendation we've come into lately. Okay. Again, this goes along with the ventilation question from before. My birds are going crazy. What should I do with the lights? First thing, dim the lights. Now, this is not necessarily going to be the final solution, but it really never hurts. If you dim the lights, it usually calms down whatever crazy behavior it is until we can figure out what's going on. How dim, you say? Well, we're going to have to get into that later. But dim the lights first. Number 2 is call Darren. Darren gets enough of these calls, so maybe skip that one. Number 3, assess the ventilation. We already talked about this. That one's a pretty easy one. Go in there, see, are there hot spots, are there cold spots? What are the birds trying to get away from? If you're sitting in there, watch the birds and try to see, are they getting away from something? Are they going towards something? Try to understand what's going on. Number 4, and I would say a couple years ago, this probably would have been number 1, but it's assess the flicker and the lighting program. Dr. Shween Lardner, who unfortunately is in the broiler program, we didn't get her for the layer program this time, just finished a really interesting research paper on birds with flicker. Again, as Darren mentioned, we're still learning a lot about chickens and how they see light, how they perceive it. We know they don't really like flicker, but we don't know how much they don't like flicker. If these lights up here were just going on a very regular basis flickering, it would drive all of us in here crazy. It would do the same for a chicken. But for some of these flickers that we can't really see, that are right at the edge of what our eyes are capable of observing, I don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it won't, but I would say there's a lot more doubt about flicker being a cause of problems. We do know that sometimes buildings are built and the electrical capacity does not match up with what the lights are. That is a real issue, because then you have lights that are visibly blinking on and off because there's too many lights on one dimmer that you're putting. If you have a 2400 watt dimmer and you have 3600 watts of lights going into that, you're going to end up with some problems. And so part of that is checking with your builders, just looking at the lights, doing a little bit of math, and trying to figure that out, especially if you're having this in the first or second flock that's going through, because that is real and we see that a lot. Other things, did you check the feed? Pretty simple. Birds without feed tend to do a little crazy things. And last, Dr. Gingrich, I'm going to make sure I give you enough time here, is going to talk over the current disease challenges that we're having. Are there any disease issues in the flock? Because it could not be the lights, it could be something else that's happening. Or it could be all of them combined. And there's a few people in here who have seen those combinations before, and it's not fun to deal with. Okay, general lights. Why are there so many different lighting environments? It's a good question. And again, we're still trying to understand what birds see. And so especially for any of you who have cage-free and especially pastured birds here in the room, understanding light is really challenging when you have outside light coming in, when you have maybe curtains up, and then when you have the lights inside the system. Or even if you're just doing cage-free and you have one color light in the aisle, you have another color light underneath the system and another in the system. Understanding these lighting environments isn't always easy, and how the birds respond to them. I don't have an answer for you. Unfortunately, a lot of it is just sitting in the chicken house and looking at the birds, trying to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. Another question I get. So this is my Hato 1 spectrometer. I see our friends from Once in the room. I'm sorry, I have to say the Hato 1. I really like, there's a spectrometer called the MK350N, which is the exact same one as this, but it's not branded by a specific lighting company. Unfortunately, it's extremely hard to find those online. And so this has been a little bit better option, and I would rather someone have a spectrometer that I know and trust that it actually works than try to find something that doesn't work online. This does not cost $15 on Amazon. It's about a $2,000 spectrometer. Unfortunately, with all the different spectrum lights that we're using, we really need a spectrometer to measure it, because it's not really easy. The regular spectrometers, the ones I bet every one of you have on your farm for just checking light intensity, or the ones, unfortunately, that your UEP or certified humane are coming out and checking, if you have your lights dim to red or dim to blue, those light meters are not going to read that. And so then they're going to say, your lights are too dim. And you're going to say, no, they're not. Look at this. And that's a constant argument we're getting into with the auditors, is what is the right spectrometer to use? What is the right light measurement? Because it's not really easy to manage. So I'm not going to go through all of these things, but if any of you have one of these or want one of these, come and talk to me, and I'll go through what you actually need to measure on here. We talked a little bit about flicker in the birds are having problems, and this does measure flicker, and so we get a lot of questions about, I'm seeing flicker, how much is too much? And usually my question is, I don't know. What are the birds doing? Are the birds okay? It's probably fine. Are the birds not okay? Check your ventilation. So that's what I care about flicker. Or if it's too late that because I think she's already left to go to the airport, email Dr. Karen and she'll help you out with that. Dimming. Who has a dimmer in their chicken house? Okay. I didn't see any hands, but I saw a lot of nods. Dimming is essential for poultry management. It's interesting that we've kind of come to full circle. When we had incandescent lights, it was really easy to dim them. And then we went to fluorescent lights. It was almost impossible to dim them. And then we went to LED lights, and some of them are easy, some of them are hard, some of them we don't really know. I would say we're kind of coming, so when LED lights first started coming in, we had only a few options, and they all came with dimmers. And then for maybe 5 to 8 years, everyone who put LED lights in was just using the generic, you go to Walmart, you buy some regular bulbs, you screw them in, and it worked great. Now, as we're getting into these more complicated systems, we're not in cages anymore. We're going back to the more complicated, more expensive lighting systems, most to all of which should have dimmers. In my experience, the DC dimmers tend to work pretty well as long as you haven't overloaded them. The AC dimmers do not work quite as well. That's where we've seen most of the problems. And whether it's a specific company dimmer that goes with the lights, or if it's a dimmer that we've seen that's off the shelf, AC dimmers just don't seem to dim quite as well. And especially once you get below 50%, we see more issues. And so if anyone's asked me, I usually recommend put a DC light in, because you're going to have an easier time, especially if we want to really control that light as we get darker. Another question I get, I'm getting out of nest eggs. What should I do with my lights? The first question I have is, where are they? So whenever you call Darren or myself with questions about this, try to ask where they are. We know that leghorns are typically better than brown birds in terms of not laying out of nest eggs, but as they get older, they're more likely to go there. Brown birds tend to lay a lot of out of nest eggs at the beginning, and then it goes down. Leghorns start slow and then tends to kind of drift up as those birds get older. We have seen one big thing and this full credit goes to Darren on this, is a mismatch between what your aisle lights are set at for dimming and what your under system lights are set at for dimming. They should be ideally within 20% of each other. So as you dim those aisle lights, you should also dim your under system lights. The reason for this is if it gets too bright in one area, then the birds will be drawn under there. And I'm sure some of you have seen just birds after they eat their lunch meal just all flooding under the system. So sometimes you need to make that a little dimmer. Other times we've seen even shutting that off completely after the morning egg laying can help, so the birds don't want to go under there. If you start seeing floor eggs in there, you need to play around with it, but it's not a straight answer. Another question I get, you asked me about my light intensity, and I started laughing. I don't know if we have enough time today to get through how to measure light intensity really properly, because it's gotten way more complicated. It used to be you take your light meter into the cage house, you put it right in front of the feed trough, maybe you do multiple levels, maybe you don't, and boom, that was your light intensity for the house. That is no longer the case. So I'm going to try in about 4 slides to talk about light intensity and measuring it, and we'll go from there. So I'm going to go back here. For light intensity in this room, in foot candles, I measured in a few different spots, so it's pretty close. Does anyone straight off the bat have a guess on what the light intensity in this room is?
22.
Other guesses? Okay. Did you bring your light meter in as well?
I did.
I can see that. It was bang on. I measured 22 in one area and 21 in another. So well done. You can see it. You're the exception. Usually, if you guys have been a little bolder, there's usually a wide range of answers. And because our eyes are not made very well to handle measuring light intensity, because our eyes intentionally try to manage it so this more or less the same amount of light is getting back into our brain. That's why our pupils expand and retract. And so it's really hard, and that's why I like having a device. If you don't have a device to measure light, I mean, there's some old school methods, taking a newspaper into the house or taking a printed one, and if you can read it at arm's length, it's light enough. Some people have better eyes than others. That's not a great way to do it. It's better to use a machine on that. So this is an aviary that I was working with, and when I first copied the slide over, it didn't copy the picture, and then I was like, you know what? I kind of like having just all the readings without the picture first, because it kind of gives you an idea of all the different places you really need to do to measure light in an aviary system. And all of the different, we have anywhere, the highest one in here is 24 foot candles. The lowest one in here is 0.8, and they're pretty close to each other. And so understanding all those different light intensities, and so when you say, what light intensity should we use? It's really tough because it's not the average of all of these, because that 24, which is right next to the light, is going to pull that average up. But you literally can't do enough readings to say, I've really gotten a representative sample. So you have to use different areas. What's your measurement under the system? What's your measurement in the aisle? What's the first perch? What's the second perch? How are we in front of the nest? These are the different questions you need to ask. And so this is a Feenhog system that we took these measurements in. And so you can see when you look down that system, it all looks pretty good. It's nice tube lighting. There's even lighting at every level. But when you go in and actually take your light meter, it's different. And so you tell me what should be the light intensity in here. And if you say, what should my light intensity be, what answer should I give you? So just an example, but anytime you go in and you're trying to figure out your light intensity, I do recommend you should be taking at least 10 locations in an aviary and standardize those, so when you're going in flock after flock, you're able to say, okay, these lights are set, they're good. The other thing that we'll recommend as well is every flock go in and measure them at full intensity, 75%, 50, and 25%. So that way you can see, because we know LED lights get a little less bright as they get older. And so as you're doing your flock cycles, and you're doing it every year to year and a half, on the Pullets you probably just need to do it once a year, you want to understand how much dimmer those lights are getting over time, because you can see for old bulbs they may be a half of what you started with, and so unless you're measuring it, you'll never know. And so this is just the indication of where to measure. You guys, I can have this presentation for you. We have it in our various things online. And it does take, again, as much as you need a light meter, you also need to go in there and look at the birds, because some systems may have more stark shadows than others. Others, you may have ventilation issues or things that aren't related to the lights at all that are causing the birds to do something. This is just another example of an aviary, very different aviary than the other one, but again, no less important on the lighting. It's a little simpler to measure it because this is a simpler aviary, but you can see everything's pretty consistent on those lights except when we go under the system. And that huge jump under the system, those really bright lights, and especially if there's a single light versus a tube light, sometimes birds will just really kind of like they're zombified, just go in under and like, ooh, bright light. And so we need to be careful for that. And then this is just in between those lights. Again, it shows you from difference of 4 feet how that there's a different lighting environment in that house. And sometimes it affects birds, sometimes it doesn't. And then this is just the summary of when we need to actually dim or measure the lights. So again, if you get a nice spectrometer, you really only need one for your entire company, as long as you clean and disinfect it in between flocks, because you're really not going to have to measure it on a day in and day out basis. And you can use a less expensive light meter to stay on the farm if you need something really important. There's another big question we get. What lights should we buy? I don't want to endorse any lights, so just buy the right ones. Pressure's on you guys. Another one we get. This company called me out of the blue, offered me a great deal in light, should I buy them? Usually my first instinct is just say no. And then I'll ask them for a little bit more details, and maybe. And then I say, talk to Darren. Darren, have you seen these lights? If Darren's not seen these lights, usually then the answer goes back to number one, no. In general, and we'll talk about this in the second one as well for what the right bulb is, as bulbs have gotten more complicated, as we've gotten different warranties, go with the manufacturer that's established, that can help you, that has an actual technical team, that if you run into issues, that way you're not trying to go through your installer or be on the phone for 3 hours over to another country as you're trying to get, because that's the only technical support that they have. So just consider that. It's one of the bigger challenges that we deal with, and I'm not an electrical engineer. I just have a lot of questions asked to me about lights. So try to find the people who actually know what they're doing and manage that if you're putting new lights into your system. Another question we get, do we need warm or cool lights? Yes, you do. This is where we get into having lights that can do multiple things, change color, cover, whether it's for the pullets or the layers. The general rule that we used to have is you do cool lights for pullets, warm lights for layers. That's no longer the case. Again, you see everyone who has an aviary system, you usually have multiple colors lights. You got one color light in the aisle, you have another one in the system. On the layer side, almost every aviary has a cool light underneath the system, which helps keep the birds out, and then warm lights in the system, and then maybe a third type of light up in the aisle. And so we really need flexibility when we're doing lights. One answer is not going to help you anymore. The lights I bought are not working. I get this one a lot. What do you think? Vote of hands. Should we all just ask Darren? Yeah. We have multiple Darrens to choose from here. No, this is, I mean, go through everything else we've talked about, check your electricity, understand what it is, and please contact your manufacturer, because that's usually what I'll end up telling you to do, or Darren will tell you to do. Another question I get, and this is the hot topic at IPPE a couple weeks ago. What is a 4-channel light, and is that important? Also, the answer is yes. 4-channel lights, that's kind of that's been the popular light that's been coming on the system. There are a few companies that were making these before. Basically, that just means that there's 4 different LED lines in that bulb that can independently operate. And the typical one is you've got a red, a green, a blue, and then a white. And then you can mix and match together to make whatever color lights you need. Again, these have come down in price massively from where they were even 5 years ago. And so it makes a lot of sense to have that flexibility, at the very least, in your aisle. Whether it's the pullet aisle or the layer aisle, you want to have that multiple color in there because that will make your life easier. You can get away with a one-type bulb underneath the system or in the system, but really in the aisle, strongly recommend a 4-channel light. That's all I have for today. You guys will have to listen to me again in about an hour whenever they get to the full session. So thank you very much, and any questions? Yes, so on the dimming, now again, it depends on the situation, it depends on the system. So are we dealing with a combi system? Are we dealing with a regular aviary with a true nest? And those answers are very different. So for instance, if it's a true aviary, I do want to keep the lights on a little bit brighter in that system because that's where the feed is and they have a darker nest. And so we still want them to go into that nest and not necessarily lay wherever in that system. If it's a combi system, even though the feed is in there, they're laying anywhere. And so I'm much more willing to go darker inside a combi than I am in a true aviary because it's just a different system and you don't have a true nest. And so, but I still want, whatever it is, most of the time I still want the inside the system to be the brightest spot in the house. And I'm measuring that pretty close. So even measuring within, I mean, if your water line is right there, you're measuring a foot or two away from those lights, which automatically is going to make it brighter for you than the aisle. And real quickly on the aisles, I mean, we see dimming the aisles down pretty dark sometimes, or going to different spectrums in the afternoon. That's another thing that we've been working on that we're still trying to figure out. But there's a lot of different things that we can try, but a lot of it depends on the system. So I'm going to talk to me in the hallway afterwards if you have any questions, and we'll hand it back over.